Welcome to the Action Network podcast presented by BetMGM. This is our best bets episode for the 2024 Masters, teeing off this week at Augusta National. My name is Maria Marino, and joining me are two very special guests. Spencer Aguiar, golf betting expert and co-host of Links and Locks, the golf betting podcast from the Action Network, and NFL Network, Cynthia Freeland, analytics expert, passionate model maker, and the newest Action Network contributor for all things golf. These two will be examining their respective models and delivering the biggest edges they're seeing for this week at Augusta. But before we dive into those, for our listeners who may not bet golf on a regular basis, Spencer, I'll start with you. What makes the Masters a unique tournament from a golf modeling or gambling perspective?
I think the Masters delivers a really unique outlook from a statistical perspective when you dive into the data. Like, obviously, part of that answer is going to stem from the fact that it's the only major championship that takes place at the same track yearly. It's always nice when you can pull 100 years of expected returns at a venue, with about 20 of those outcomes yielding top-notch statistical expectations after shot tracking got added to the equation. Cynthia, this, I'm sure, like not having to extrapolate out expectations typically helps the process of rendering predictability when you run a model. That is not necessarily too dissimilar to other courses on tour that have been inside the rotation for a while. You look at any of your run-of-the-mill events, but I think the real separating quality that makes Augusta National the most predictable venue on tour in terms of rollover success rate really stems from two main points. One, we get these sub 90-man fields every year. That generates about 30% of the participants who will land under one of two issues when you look at past results. The first would be only one golfer's ever won this event over the age of 45. That was Jack Nicklaus in 1986 when he won at the age of 46. Don't shoot the messenger here. That would remove 7 players. That's going to include Tiger Woods, Phil Mickelson from the mix. I think the problem in that area, if you're really trying to find from an analytical standpoint of why it doesn't work, there's massive undulation at this property. It takes a toll on your body having to walk and play this venue over 4 days. And then the second part of that equation comes down to that we've only had one first-time winner since 1979. That would be Fuzzy Zeller. I do believe this year probably delivers the best crop of participants in that area in a while. You have names like Ludwig Oberg, Wyndham Clark. Those are high-end names that you don't typically see playing their first Masters with this much past success. But even if we want to keep them in the mix and say that those are names that have a potential to win, we're still talking about an additional 20% of participants that likely, if we're shooting for pure win equity in this situation, lose a lot of that discussion. And really, it's the latter of that explanation of the first-timers that we're talking about with trying to find demonstrating predictability here of there are so many nuances of Augusta National that's going to take time to learn. Multiple tiered perspective on the putting surfaces. That's going to produce nearly 60% more 3-putts than average. You have all these runoff locations on the surface. This is a very fun track because we have all the data that we can possibly look for at this venue. I think we can talk about aggression, and it's something that I'll get into a little bit later, where I think certain guys like Bryson DeChambeau, they look at this wide open facility and they believe that there's the potential to just bomb away here, but that's not necessarily the best blueprint for success. You're going to have to be good around the green. You're going to have to be good with your putter. You're going to have strategy at this course besides just having distance. So it's a very nuanced facility that makes for a fun betting board at the biggest event of the year.
I love everything you said. Obviously, the core stuff makes it, analytically speaking, very, I'm not going to use the word easy, but the comps are really direct because you have the comps right here. But ultimately, what I'm looking at in this year's specifically is really the impact. Now we have Live coming, like what is going on with that? So I'm kind of looking at, all right, we have this rich database of historical perspectives, usually have recent form, and everyone's sort of plus or minus a match here or there in the same sort of recent form. Well, this is completely different. So let's see, now we get to test drive some of our models to see if, does we always talk about fading, right? Like it's not good for fades if you're at Augusta. And is that true? Does that hold? Especially now that these guys who've been playing on Live have like different experiences with that. They're coming off of a different set of circumstances. So just like, Spencer put it so perfectly, like I totally agree with you. But now we're just adding in this extra element of these people not playing in the same form. Like even, John Rahm, who I'm going to talk about here in a second, but that's going to be an interesting note coming off of what he's been doing at Live. Do those data points, do they kind of line up? We'll see.
It's so interesting that there's a narrative situation here that you can factor into how you want to bet this. And Spencer, I also thought it was interesting, like how you talked about the older golfers, struggling at this course because it is so taxing on your body, but also some more experienced golfers with this tricky course that, knowing how to play it might become a factor as well. That being said, let's get right into our best bets and or biggest edges. So Spencer, where are you going first?
So my models seem to believe that multiple things are occurring on this board that are likely an overreaction to certain groupthink mentalities. I will keep this answer strictly towards betting here over any of the DFS portions of the discussion that we'd want to have, but I'm always going to trust my math in these spots. I understand that there's a belief that certain players can't win because of past mistakes, but if we go into this tournament under that assumption, like who are we truly left with that can capture this title? Like Scotty Scheffler 5-1, sure. I mean, he's playing historically great golf when you look at the ball striking numbers. John Rahm in that 12-1 territory, defending champion, makes a lot of sense for that reason. Brooks Koepka 20-1. My model's always been lower on Koepka than public consensus. I think that's been one of those weaker blind spots where my math just cannot properly equate this increased output that we get from him in major championships. Like my dad has never viewed him as this elite golfer, but you throw him in. Yeah, exactly.
He wants it more. He wants it more.
She's doing
Whatever
air
that
quotes.
Factor.
Whatever that ends up being, I mean, he's produced victories out of it, so I don't necessarily want to take that away from him. But like, you can sell me on any of those three options being worth considering. But the point remains to this discussion that I'm having. If the math dictates that there are more than three people who can win, there are naturally going to be a handful of golfers that are drifting way too far up this board because of these preconceived notions from past struggles. The very first outright bet that I placed was on Xander Schauffele at 22-1. That number has trickled down more into the 16 to 18-1 range since reopening on Monday, but I actually still think there's a little value to be had at the price. This is an argument that I've made a few times already this week, but give Xander a single victory at any point this year, and that is what we are lacking from the profile. I think he's 12-1 in this tournament, and without that victory, we don't have it right now, but like, I know what I'm signing up for when it comes to my outright card. There's clearly going to be this public disdain that turns into any of these wagers where all you hear is this "I told you so" rebuttal when or if Xander goes out there and doesn't win this tournament. It's much easier to punch these reduced price tickets on. I don't want to necessarily throw out individual names here and like cherry pick options, but I think there's a lot of options that make sense. But like, take a Jordan Spieth, for example. You have this built-in tax that's coming into play because of this past success that we have seen at the Masters. In a vacuum situation, I like him this week. I think he makes a lot of sense for anybody that wants to bet him, but it's one of those situations where people are more willing to overpay and get a worse price on somebody like Jordan Spieth just because you can point to the narrative. He's a major champion. He's won the Masters before. He's always competing at Augusta versus this like getting caught in a web of going against the perceived grain here. And when Xander doesn't produce, all of a sudden you have a problem. But according to my model, that's where the value really comes into play. So I always run my model to project three separate outcomes. I want pure upside. That's going to remove any of your non-statistical downside traits. I want safety. That's essentially going to highlight made cut equity for this tournament. And then I also want an overall grade that helps form the primary blueprint of my projection that I'm using most heavily here. Naturally, Scotty Scheffler, top-ranked player in this model. I think you're making massive errors with the way that you're building your math if you're coming out with any other answer than that. But I do want to note, because it's very noteworthy for this tournament, Schauffele was the first man in almost a year that when I ran this purely from an upside perspective, actually graded higher than Scotty Scheffler for me. You add in some of these other weights, and all of a sudden Scotty jumps back into the mix to number one. But my model placed Schauffele first in this field for proximity over 200 yards in 2024. He's also first in all these additional categories. Weighted proximity from 150 to 175 yards over a 2-year running perspective. Expected par 3 and par 4 scoring. Weighted scrambling, and then projected strokes gained total, which is just recalculating the data to fit Augusta National here. I get the risk. I get this is a golfer that has not won since July of 2022, but I think we've gotten too caught up in this narrative that Xander can't get across the finish line. And from a mathematical perspective, my model really likes Schauffele this week.
My model agrees, and I like Schauffele too. And I'm with you on Scheffler being number one for most. I do a couple versions of models too. I do like, depends on how I want to do it, but I've been up to like 5 sometimes because I'm crazy. But ultimately I was kind of like, well, where is there some value? It's boring to take Scotty Scheffler. It's okay, maybe it's not boring. Maybe that's fun. I don't know. But I'm looking back at the Jon Rahm situation. And of course, I'm looking at the driving statistics from Liv. Okay, so back up one step here. Back-to-back champs, we get it. There's only been 3. That's not a lot. But I don't necessarily think that is to me is not very predictive at all. I think recent form is very interesting. And it really was his driving statistic that put enough risk into my model where he could have a good upside. Do I think he should be the odds on favorite to win? No, but I think that he should ultimately be in consideration, especially, DFS formats. I think that the price and the return on your investment there is very, very smart. And then I'm looking at look, what he's done over 8 starts in Live. I mean, he leads them all in driving. It's a different format, so it's very hard to kind of recalibrate it for, I come from football, right? So it's very similar to kind of recalibrating like the college quarterback rating to the passer rating to the NFL passer rating and trying to figure that out. That's kind of the analogy I'll draw there. But I think that if someone's poised to have some good upset and make them be the 4th back-to-back winner, that could be, Jon Rahm.
You know what we're talking about here with Jon Rahm? It's an overcorrection to the market where I don't think that if you look directly at Scotty Scheffler at 5-1 and Jon Rahm at 12-1, there's that big of a disparity between those two players, but it's one of those situations of out of sight, out of mind, playing a tour that people want to call whatever names of an exhibition or whatever we want to put to it at the end of the day. I think that it's one of those situations where this price has drifted a little bit too much. And I do tend to agree with you. Like, he's the second ranked player in my model from an overall sense. There's a ton to like about his game here. And I'm always looking for the drift to occur in a market. I'm trying to find the reverse narrative of what the public is saying and where can the value actually be found on this board. And for me, Rahm is one of those names that I do believe he's drifted too far up this board away from the Scotty Schefflers. I know what Scheffler's doing is historic, but I don't know if it's as big of a difference as public perception would lead you to believe here.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially, the way that I look at this and try to characterize it and look for differences in volatility. To me, volatility is like, okay, what are are you reaching certain thresholds? Like, you can't be below X of a putter, right? Just not going to happen. You can't be below X strokes gained on your approach. Just not going to happen here. What's your recent form with iron play? What's your recent form strokes gained tee to green? Like, what is going on with that? And then driving, to me, I probably overestimate accuracy in at the Masters, maybe a bit more than other people, at least other models that I've been able to see. But I actually do think that it matters. And then later on, we'll talk about a decent comp for it for like some of your undervalued or maybe like surprise candidates. But I don't know, I'm big on Rahm this week. I'm all in on Rahm. I like it.
Sounds good. Rahm with top 10s in 5 of the past 6 years at Augusta National. Now, Spencer, for your next bet, you're looking at someone to finish in the top 20.
I love Cynthia's answer of volatility. That's something that I want to touch on later in the show because volatility is oftentimes looked at in the wrong direction when you're talking about numbers and models here. But I'm going to go with a player that I actually think is safe in this perspective. He has a bunch of win equity inside of my sheet, though, too. That's Matthew Fitzpatrick, plus 130 for a top 20. I also played this early in the week as an outright at 50 to 1. It's dropped more into that 40 to 1 range now. Still think that's a perfectly acceptable price. He graded within the top 10 win equity candidates inside of my model, delivered a positive trajectory of finishes at this course over the past 4 years. 2 of those results that we're looking at most recently, 14th and 10th on the leaderboard. We have seen him undergo extensive training throughout the past year to add extra distance to his game. I once again agree with Cynthia here, where I don't think distance is the only prerequisite that you need for success. I do think accuracy and that, like, I kind of mentioned this with DeChambeau, and I think it comes into play with Rory in some ways also, and I'll talk about Rory later, but almost like too much aggression and too much distance sometimes can be a negative in this spot, and I think that's why, like, that overall safety and finding fairways does have some merit here, but at the end of the day, I also still want golfers that are going to have a certain prerequisite in my model. It's reaching that threshold amount that I need to actually find the success rate that I want. And for me, if you're outside of the top 50 in my model in strokes gained off the tee or from driving distance, those are 2 points for me that become a problem. And we have seen Fitzpatrick here. Extensive training in the past year to add extra distance to his game. I think that marginally held him back from starting this season with proper form. And the reason behind that comes down to he added a 4-gram weight to his driver. He had forgotten to remove it for almost a year. That is a shockingly bad mistake for someone who is tracking every single shot that he does in his notebook. But it also helps to explain this erratic nature he's experienced since his RBC Heritage victory last season. The data is going to pretty much tell the entire story there. Since he's removed the weight and he's gotten it more to his natural feel there, he's gained 0.91 strokes off the tee per event over his past 6 starts. That compares to losing 0.875 in the 8 appearances before that. If you're going to give real driving returns back to one of the better short game players in the world, we know how he finds success at these hard courses every single time he plays them. I truly believe the sky is the limit here for him.
I love that. I was just looking to see about my next pick here to make sure I wanted to see his exact age. 26 for Theegala. Are we good with that? I mean, you die in your 40s, right? I should be on the lookout. Oh no. But my next pick is Theegala. Obviously last year was his debut. I wasn't on him. I'm going to say I was completely wrong about him last year. He finished number 9, which was a really nice debut. I think last year on the broadcast, they kept likening him to Jordan Spieth, which I thought was like, not funny, but like kind of funny. Because then I look through the data and I'm like, maybe, but not like they're just a different, I don't know. They totally different sort of, anyways, but sure. He could be more like Jordan Spieth in the sense of being a winner here. So ultimately for me, I'm looking at his last, the recent form. So 9 starts, 4 top 10s, the recent form with his driver. We keep going back to this, but and you talk about that aggression, that doesn't seem to be the way that he earns his hay, right? Like it's more of the accuracy and the ability that the driver is giving you, strokes gains with your driver basically over the past several weeks. So for me, when I'm looking at like recent form coming into this, someone that could surprise you. In fact, it sort of surprised me because in my model, Theegala ends up in your top 10 in like 45% of simulations, which I'm a conservative modeler, so that probably for some other people would be closer to 55% because like everything looks low in my models. I never really have a scenario where someone's like 90 and then doesn't have, like that just doesn't happen. So it's a really strong DFS play and a really strong, like very nice. I mean, of course he could win, but I'm more projecting a potential top 10 finish for this. And the number for, top 20% is like in the high 60s. So that, or top 20 finish, excuse me, is in the high 60s. So that is, to me, I don't know. I think that's a fun one that at least ahead of this one, I sort of forgot about that whole narrative. And then I was rewatching last year. I'm like, oh yeah, the new Jordan Spieth. What? So yeah.
Yes. Go on, Spencer.
No, I was just going to say, like, he is inside of the top 13 of my model in projected win equity in this tournament. And that number gets even better when we start talking about some of those safety ratings. So that would be cash game plays for DFS and matchup wagers and some of those placement market bets that Cynthia just alluded to right there. Usually when I have negative trajectory in my model for upside, those players become better suited as a placement bet. And maybe we're a year or two too early here on Theegala actually having the capabilities to win here. I'd like to see him here for 2 or 3 more years. And I think at some point, this is one of the better chances he has to win a major title. But the safety ratings in my model and the way that he produced, it's an intriguing return when you're talking about still top 13 win equity projections with top 7 safety marks. So it's a very nice profile there from
Are you saying I'm
Theegala.
boring? Are you calling me boring on our first podcast?
He would
Gavin?
never.
I would never do such a thing.
Spencer, it's okay. Sometimes I'm boring. It's cool. Sometimes you need a few safe assets in your DFS portfolio. You just need a few.
That's how you build your bankroll in general. Like I am all about these safer markets. Like how I build my portfolio and betting comes from matchups and placement bets. That's how my ROI increases throughout the year. It's not necessarily hitting a bunch of outrights. It is nice when I come on an Action Network show. I mention Wyndham Clark to win the US Open, and it ends up happening at 100 to 1.
You?
Yeah. I mean, like Wyndham Clark seems to be the name that has consistently produced a bunch of great results when I have given picks on Action Network shows. But it's those safer profiles of how we're going to build our bankroll and how we're going to increase our money. So there is nothing wrong, Cynthia, with safety.
For your birthday this year, I'm gonna get you like a snow globe with Wyndham Clark in it, and when every time you pick him, you have to be like, "It's the Wyndham Clark crystal ball." I'm gonna find one. Somebody somewhere has to make that.
Yeah, it'll be my most treasured possession if that does end up happening.
It's gonna happen. I can feel it. Speaking of what's gonna happen, Spencer, your next best bet.
Let's talk a little bit more about these safety markets, and we'll transition here into Austin Eckroat to make the cut at -110. I talked a little bit about extrapolating out this data, and I do think you have to be very careful here with the projections. This is a first-time participant at Augusta National. It's funny because if it wasn't a course that demanded such a specific skill set and just took the field and threw them into any random event, let's just say the Farmers Insurance Open, just for a basic answer, I still think there's some course predictability there, but my model would push this more out into the -150 range as being the proper price, just because of this recent onslaught of production that we've gotten from him. 11 made cuts in 12 tournaments, a victory at the Cognizant Classic in March, 37 spot increase in expected strokes gained around the green when you compare that to his 2-year baseline with just the 2024 stats that I ran. I did try to suppress the returns a little bit. I gave him a 65th place projection for course production here. I do think that the lack of historical productivity that he has obviously hurts him a little bit, but the fact that he's still graded as a value, even when I took it in that direction, all of a sudden showed that when I said that in my model, he's a fringe top 50 player on a course, and that just moves him into, give him a couple made cuts here, which he doesn't have, and all of a sudden it changes the trajectory in my model. All of a sudden that moved him as the best value that I had on the board to make the cut. So I think similar comp courses, he looks great. He has a top 15 projection on these more challenging par 4 holes. That's something that's going to help to reduce those bogey making potentials that come into play on some of those longer par 4s. I think there's enough floor here that he gets himself into the weekend. Don't really need any of that ceiling. Just make the cut and we can go from there. But thought -110 was too short of a price, just really because he's a first timer here at the Masters and the market overcorrected itself. And as you guys can tell, that's kind of the blueprint to a lot of my model here. It's when you get these extreme deviations from the norm of what numbers are spitting out, that to me is where the value is always going to come into play. So if I can find things that I disagree with on the market, I thought at -110, you get about 30 to 40 points of value.
I love that. So I'm going with a volatile one here, or one that in my model has a bit more volatility, and that's Hideki Matsuyama. When you're looking at him, especially in DFS lineups, it's kind of an expensive one, at least. I mean, I don't know. So that's kind of what it comes up for me in my DFS models. But ultimately, when I'm looking at this one, it's very interesting because usually I think like putting when I think about him, and that hasn't necessarily in recent form been his strongest attribute, but the greens and regulation, all of the thresholds, he meets kind of the areas where I think you need like some good threshold values to be a top 10 or top 20 finisher. And he comes up as both of those for me, and almost at the same level of some of the more expensive guys. Like, in fact, he has a better chance, better odds of being in the top 10 than Rory. So I thought that was kind of like a cool comp there. Again, it could go south though. Like, this is not safe. This is the unsafe. This is the unboring Cynthia. This is not the boring person, but because it could go either really well or really poorly. So this would be a tournament play if you're using it in DFS. That for me, I'm thinking about using as a building block. The safety is off. So like my volatility rating on him is about like of the guys in that similar kind of tier, it's about as high as you can get. So I thought that was interesting though. No, unboring pick though.
We're getting a little bit of everything from you today, Cynthia. Matsuyama, of course, won the Masters back in 2021. Okay, Spencer, who else you like?
So this is a safe space, right?
Yes, of course. Yes.
I want to talk about volatility. I was going to save it for the end of the show, but Cynthia keeps mentioning
I'm sorry.
it.
I messed you up. I'm
That's fine. We love some volatility.
I'm pretty sure. I mean, we can ask Matt Mitchell on this. I'm pretty sure I'm not allowed to talk about Rory McIlroy at the Masters anymore on an Action Network show. If you want to hear the deep dive of it, maybe I can sneak it into the Links and Locks podcast that I do. But I've done this 3 consecutive years at the Masters. I know people have gone a lot deeper than that. I'll save the full answer there, but I think people hear volatility and always think of the worst with that answer, but it really does play both ways. Like, the high upside marks for Rory in my sheet, love him. I don't think it's for the faint of heart. I understand the downside. I understand that this is what's happening when you're trying to capture the career Grand Slam here, and pressure comes into play. And maybe that's the unquantifiable factor that you just cannot get to in a model. But 1.88 strokes earned per round at the Valero with his approach game. That's the best output in 5 years that I had for him since the Wells Fargo in 2019. Only also had 6 events in general that graded better than that. 4 of those 6 came during McIlroy's prime in 2013 or prior. So I'm going to leave it there. Don't want to lose my work here at Action Network. I apologize to everybody that I did go down this Rory route, but I'm going to go with Harris English here for a top 20 at plus 345. Course history is okay. I don't think it's anything to write home about necessarily, but 3 made cuts in 4 attempts, nothing better than a 21st place finish. However, the interesting note to that factor is that this season's going to be the first time that he's ever gotten a chance to play the Masters in back-to-back years. Maybe there's something he can build off of in that area. I know the Valero Texas Open worried some people last week after he provided a miscut performance, lost 4.3 strokes ball striking, but this has also turned into one of those overcorrections to the market because of the one-off result. I'm going to trust this 4 top 21s that he'd produced before that. He had averaged 3.35 shots tee to green during those starts. We also get short game mastery here of a golfer that ranked inside of the top 10 producers for me in expected short game around the green and expected putting for this course. Like, there's a handful of golfers. I've mentioned a few of them, but like Austin Eckroat, Harris English, Chris Kirk, Taylor Moore, Adam Shank, Siwoo Kim. These were all names for me. And I know even the next name that Cynthia is going to talk about later, that's another name that fit into the mix for me there. There are these players deeper down the board that have real potential to be used in different avenues of this market. It's just kind of mixing and matching and finding where that correct spot is to do it. And I think for Harris English, plus 345 for a top 20 gives you a lot of that value for a very cheap investment.
I like that one. You know where I'm going, right? Because we
Yes.
obviously look at each other in advance. Corey Connors is my pick for the next one. When I'm looking at the opportunity that has, it's like really about playing through the weekend. So especially in DFS lineups, this is a really good one to kind of round out your, roster with the right 6 people or whatever number you're using in whatever format you're playing in. But to me, I'm looking at like that kind of top 20 area as a potential upside. I'm not suggesting that Corey Connors is coming for Scotty's gold. He's not coming for his bag, but I'm talking about consistency and someone who it's going to exceed expectations from the standpoint of where they're valued in, at least I'm looking at the DFS market because, as an NFL employee, I don't know anything about anything else. Don't know what any of these other words mean. But ultimately, when I'm looking at all of these different things, you're trying to figure out, okay, where is there enough consistency? And this would be a 16th made weekend. And that's a pretty consistent pattern. And then a number of the metrics that have, like, to me, I really dug in this time about like approach shots and driving accuracy. And it feels like he's in the right spot to get himself to make the cut and potentially as the upside be the in a top 20.
Yeah, I think for me, if we're talking, we'll talk about DFS for 1 second. Connors, Jaeger, Henley, those are 3 names at the very bottom of this board here that possess a lot of that made cut equity that you're trying to find. So I like to play Cynthia.
And just to clarify, Spencer, so you were talking about Connors as sort of fitting into that group of like with the Harris Englishes of the world.
I think there's a lot of value on any of the 3 names that I just mentioned. Like there's playability on those targets, whether we, I took Eckroat, for example, and I took it to make a cut, but I think there's matchup potential to look at for Corey Connors. Great safety ratings in my model. Russell Henley has that same sort of trajectory that I'm looking for. And then Jaeger is the fun one here because my model has been so bullish on Jaeger. Like Maria, we've done a bunch of shows together at this point, and I think any single time I'm on with you, Jaeger finds a way to make the show. And I had him 2 weeks ago at the Houston Open where I had him at 50-1, and it's that increase that we've seen with the driver. Very similar to Matthew Fitzpatrick. He has worked on the speed training. We've seen that return with increased data off the tee. He's an intriguing name to keep an eye on, maybe to even shoot that a little bit further up the board than some people would expect.
And to follow on that, I love Jaeger too. I've looked at, for players who have not played in the Masters before, that Texas course, the Houston course, Memorial, is a nice comp, in terms of like the lack of rough, the lack of, out of bounds, like all of the way that the undulation, that's silly, but like whatever, the way that the putting greens work, the undulations are very similar, but it's a good comp. And he obviously, you picked him to win there. Your crystal ball was perfectly spot on for that one. But if you're looking for, to me, that's like, I'm not going to tell any of my friends who play in DFS that would ever potentially play against me until after. Then I'm gonna be like, see, like that's the to me, that's like the fun of a Jaeger this year. I feel like could be the Theegala of next year. Maybe not top 9, but you know what I'm saying.
There you go. Well, Spencer, you have one more best bet for us.
I'm going to go with Chris Kirk over Eric Van Rooyen. You get this output in my sheet that is very intriguing because it's safety marks for Chris Kirk versus this boom or bust candidate in Van Rooyen. That's an output that we see Kirk grading 21st overall for his safety rating. That compares against Van Rooyen landing 57th. That alone puts us into about this minus 125 range of disparity of where the price should be compared to where it opened. We then gain an additional 10 to 15 points, depending on how aggressive we want to get with it when I run my numbers there, to where Kirk's overall rating of 23rd far exceeds what we get with Van Rooyen of his 61st place return there. I understand the driving distance projections will look stout for Van Rooyen. I think Cynthia brought up a good point where that's maybe not the sole thing that you should be looking at here. I think people see a wide open venue at Augusta and always think just bomb away with it. But that's not exactly how I ran my model either. And you all of a sudden run into these really troubling returns with him when you look at the runoff, the undulation that Cynthia talked about there, throughout this property. He could only muster up a ranking of 83rd in this field for projected strokes gained around the green. That's going to place below almost all the non-amateurs that I had this week. And then you get this equally poor putting number from him of 76th when I reprojected his totals specifically for Augusta National. So that's going to take these fiery bent grass greens. It's going to take these multiple tiered perspectives. It's going to take the avoidance that's needed of 3-putt percentage. I just think here we get a golfer here in Kirk that has much greater potential to play all 4 rounds of golf. And I'm always looking in my matchups to find volatility. I want miscut potential. I don't want this bet. And I know the Masters, we have a limited field here, so it's a little bit more difficult to find that miscut potential, but I don't want volatility in this sense to come into play, because if I can end this on a Friday afternoon, I then don't have to worry about what Chris Kirk produces. So I'm always trying to find the safety in these markets. And I mean, even still, Maria, I talked about this with you a handful of weeks ago. It's always the fade candidate that I'm looking to take on versus the person I'm trying to back. So if you have different matchups out there available to you, it would be a fade of Erik van Rooyen versus backing Chris Kirk in that regard.
I got a quick one for you. Does your model prefer, which Cameron does your model prefer, Smith or Young? Because when I'm looking at this one, there's a very distinct winner of the battles of the Cameron.
The market disagrees with my answer here, so I'm curious to hear what your response would be, but my model liked Cameron Smith this week.
You know what? Mine likes Young. So finally, we got to have one thing we disagree on. I just think, and it's all volatility. So safe is Smith. Unsafe is Young. So to me, it's like, well, that's kind of how it plays out. So I guess in the safety market, we agree, but in the upside market, I think it's Young.
You know, an interesting play I was looking at, and it's not something that I have recommended at any point yet. I do think there's very
good. We're getting exclusive content right here.
Aha.
I normally want a 3% edge on these matchups. And this was something for me that had a 2.4% edge. So it didn't quite reach the threshold amount. It's still worth the bet. You can do the math, figure out where you can get to with it, where it makes sense. But Cameron Young minus 110 over Justin Thomas was something that my model seemed to like a little bit this week. The perception around Justin Thomas is all over the place. I think
it depends on what episode of that show people are on, I think.
Yeah, Justin Thomas at this point is about as boom or bust as you can get with this answer. And I think from like a safety market where I agree with you, like the Young profile is a little bit more of that upside to begin with too. So you kind of have these two boom or bust plays inside of my sheet for me, but I couldn't get there on Justin Thomas. I know a lot of sharp people that are on Thomas this week. I just see he's lost bones on his bag for his caddy. Some of these around the green metrics and these putting numbers for me, I have massive concerns about what we're actually going to get. Everybody can take that exactly what it's worth there of the 2.4% edge that I had, but just my viewpoint on that bet of a different way to consider Cameron.
I have Young considerably more better rated than JT.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And I like him. It's not personal. It's just, it's the approach stuff, like you said, around the green.
Yeah.
Some bonus advice from you both, and the insight overall has been fantastic. Let's recap. So Spencer, your 5 picks for the 2024 Masters are Xander Schauffele outright at 18-1, Matthew Fitzpatrick plus 130 for a top 20 and a sprinkle outright, Austin Eckroat to make the cut minus 110, Harris English top 20 at plus 345, and Chris Kirk minus 110 over Erik van Rooyen. And Cynthia, your 5 biggest model edges are on Jon Rahm, who is currently 10-1 outright. Sahith Theegala currently 45-1. Bit of a volatile pick here with Hideki Matsuyama as a tournament play. Corey Connors in DFS or as a top 20. Steven Jaeger currently 150-1 outright. Okay, so for our producer, Matt Mitchell, for Spencer Aguiar, and for Cynthia Freeland, I'm Maria Marino. Thanks so much for listening to the Best Bets episode for the 2024 Masters. This podcast will return with our UFC episode this Friday, along with lots of NFL draft content leading up to round 1 on April 25th. Best of luck betting the Masters this week, and we'll see you back here next time on the Action Network podcast, presented by BetMGM.